Hello, today's video is about modelling. And what do I mean by modelling? I mean making the implicit explicit. This is a phrase that I've stolen from Jeff Barton and David Didow, who stole it from Jeff Barton. The idea that students understand what we're talking about in the classroom is one that we take for granted, but actually is something we can't rely on at all. And this video is going to help you delve into how to make things very specific and very explicit to your students so they know what success looks like. And that starts with the big picture.
In today's video, I'd like to consider different ways of modelling writing. And I'm going to use an English lesson. I apologise for this because we often dismiss literacy as the province of the English department. But I'm an English teacher and these are the examples of writing that came easily to hand. The idea behind this is so that once you've seen these different ways of modelling, you will then be able to adapt them to your subject, and I'll try to be explicit about how you can do that. And in my own school, I'm looking at ways of gauging whether I need to offer further training or not, and the response to this video will help me do that. So I began by introducing my Middleset Year 10s. So their FFT D predictions showed 30 predicted D and C grades, 2 were predicted B. This would put them in the top 25% of similar students for progress. Their self-reported targets were all C to A, none of them predicted a D for themselves, with the majority at B. And so I had to ask myself 3 questions. Firstly, should I be pragmatic and model the DC in Year 10, hope for greater maturity for CB in Year 11? Or should I mostly teach towards the C grade and then some B grade, which I'd introduce in Year 10 and then into Year 11? Or should I mostly model the B grade with some C? And I got an interesting response on the training day, with most staff thinking that I ought to model B and A grade teaching, which is delightful. Having high expectations is a brilliant way to get your students to succeed. But I would have a little word of caution here. We often have to teach the C grade skills more explicitly so that students can jump from the C up to an A. So you have to embed the basics, as it were. We can't just leap through blooms straight up through to analysis and evaluation if we haven't adequately taught knowledge, which is often what the C grade will test. My class were looking at an essay on poems by Wilfred Owen. They had to compare 3 poems. So the first poem I took was Futility, and I made a YouTube video for them on how to get a B, and gave them the task of watching this video as well as suffering my teaching on it in the classroom. This video made explicit not just the subject content, but also the skills they would need to demonstrate in the exam, or in this case, the controlled assessment. I then did the same with another poem, Inspection, the second poem which they had to study, and likewise we covered it fully in class, so that these videos became a way for the students to deepen their understanding. I then decided that Futility was the easiest poem on which to explore deeper understanding, and consequently made a new video that would take the students to A and A star, should they so choose. The fact that it got 26 views suggests that many of my students did in fact choose to watch it, but I didn't monitor this. Then finally I prepared another video on the third poem, Exposure, titled Everything You Need to Know, and that went from the C grade all the way up to the A star. Again, most of my class seem to have viewed this, as well as other viewers, and would have gained, if they'd paid enough attention, an excellent understanding of the content of the poems and how to write about them in the controlled assessment. It would of course be very simple just to tell the students what they had to know about the poem and tell them what to think. However, that is not an English skill, and it may not be a skill, I hope, in your subject. You have to encourage students to think for themselves. So here I got one student sitting at the computer. Here is a stanza of the poem, and they would write their ideas as notes in the body of the poem. Or they would act as scribes listening to a class discussion and making notes about what other students in the class said. And these notes in purple are then available to the rest of the class instantly because they're projected onto the screen in real time, and students can choose to take them or adapt them or just keep their own notes which they have made prior to the discussion. In this way I was able to model what note-taking looks like, a future exam skill. I was able to model what class discussions look like because students have to keep probing deeper, or my questioning would certainly do that for them. And we did this for each of the 3 poems, so they had ample notes either that they'd provided themselves or that they'd got from a partner during preparation for the discussion, or that they had stolen from the student who was scribing the discussion at the board. Because I couldn't rely on any of my note takers in the class to leap suddenly to an A grade, I also modelled what A grade note taking might look like, and I was really explicit. So in black you can see where I've added notes that are attached to grades, and in blue we have the sections of the poem that the notes concern. So I wasn't expecting students to instantly retain all of this, but I wanted them to have some understanding of the kind of language to use and the kind of points to make if they wanted to improve their grade. Next, I had to ask myself, having studied the poems and taken their notes, how they were going to filter it and access what they needed for the exam. In the controlled assessment, they're allowed a side of A4, and so for each poem I gave them this note-taking sheet, and it had rows across, themes or ideas in the left-hand column, and there'd probably be about 7 of these rows further down. I've just copied 2 of them, and you could see that the students had to introduce their own quotation, then they had to work out what the poetic technique was, and then they had to put in an explanation of how that quotation linked to the title or the question, and the question was about the situations and feelings that Owen was describing in the poems. So this was an attempt to get my students to be able to synthesize their notes, or if you like, thin slice them so that they were picking out what was most relevant to them and also to the question. Once we had done this for each of the 3 poems individually, I then gave them a new plan where they had to filter their note-taking further. So in each of these boxes they would need quotations from at least 2 of the poems. Again, they would steal their techniques, and here they would write their explanations. There's very small font here, you won't be able to read it, but this tells them that the explanation now could not be in sentences because that's part of the controlled assessment requirement. They could only be words or phrases. They wouldn't link together to make sense as sentences. And as long as students filled these in as they went and had different pairings of poems, they would have covered all 3 poems with comparisons along the way. And this would be the plan that they were allowed in front of them as they wrote their controlled assessment. I then needed to be really explicit about how to turn that plan into a piece of writing. So here I looked at the requirements of a C grade response, and I gave them a model of a paragraph on futility, looking at the situations and feelings in the poem, and the same with exposure. And we did that a few times for different ideas, and they would obviously themselves write their own paragraphs in response to practice those skills. I always use a really simple assessment technique. Whenever any student is writing, I try to get another student typing at the computer. So silent writing for the rest of the class, at the computer with the screen on freeze, another student types, and then at the end of the written activity, after 6 minutes, it's very rare that I have them writing for longer than 8, their contribution is revealed, and we use it to assess it and for me to diagnose what my students do know and don't know. In blue here are the teaching points that we selected in the class. So we highlighted skills here that were relevant to moving up a grade in the exam. We talked about why they are important, how the students could steal the same skills. Very often when you have that kind of discussion, you think, well, I've been incredibly explicit here, but you've done it all orally, and students can simply zone out and take nothing in. So at the same time, I made notes about all the skills that the students' writing had illustrated, because these are skills that I wanted students to use in their own paragraphs. So the next step would be for them to write a paragraph trying to demonstrate all of the skills here that we just had demonstrated. And I also highlighted the new learning that we'd discovered when we corrected that previous paragraph as a class. So here are improvements that they could also put in. Then 2/3 of the way through the controlled assessment, I was able to pause the writing and then model what a conclusion would look like. Now this is a very difficult thing to do, in as much as once you've modelled the conclusion, you then have this caveat that the students can't steal any of your sentences. They can steal your vocabulary and ideas, because that's just the same as taking them from class notes that you've given out earlier. But the trick is to be able to demonstrate fully what the skill is. Students are then able to have this model of the conclusion at home, so they can read through how it's constructed, and as long as they can remember the principles behind it, they'll be able to have a fair stab at reproducing something similar in their own writing, demonstrating the same skills, if not the same ideas precisely. During any writing activity, I also forbid my students from asking me questions. That's for two reasons. One is if they ask a question out loud, it's very often a delaying tactic. They're just not confident about what they need to write, and so look to dominate your attention in a different way. And two, there's an unwritten law in any classroom that the moment the teacher starts talking to another student, it's therefore permissible for every other student in the class to start whispering to their neighbour. And that, of course, does not lead to success. Consequently, if they have a question during silent writing time, the only way they can ask it is by writing their question down in the body of their work. This has a further advantage in that it keeps a record of my teaching with that student, relevant because it's at the same place as their work, relevant to their progress in that work. If it's an extended piece of silent writing, which I'd only do with my controlled assessments, then students have to write their questions on the board. This has a further advantage in that many students will have the same question, and once they see the question go up and the teacher's response in blue, they can easily see whether that also applies to them. I can't count how often I refer back to a previous question, and I have a tremendous advantage here in that this will go on for 2 or 3 lessons, and I'm easily able to refer back to an answer that I've given earlier. So again, I can be really explicit. It doesn't interfere with the flow of learning of the rest of the class because it's silent. I can have one set of answers here on the screen, and if students need something from an earlier lesson, I simply freeze the screen and we scroll back and they can find the answer to their question from somebody's earlier response. Right, that's how I modelled the actual writing, but a huge amount of a student's success is actually determined by their effort. Students, of course, are much more likely to see it as being determined by their intelligence. They're often victims of a fixed mindset. And so in order to change that, I've been using Show My Homework this term in order to grade the students' work. As you can see, in the first months of the term, I was really only using it to record what homework students had done before I realised that I could actually set quizzes on Show My Homework and get a record of the students' percentages. Now, if we go back to the videos I created, I asked my students to watch a couple of those videos, and I attached a Show My Homework multiple choice quiz to each video, making sure not only that they had watched the video, but that they had understood it. Show My Homework is also an excellent diagnostic tool, not just of the students' effort, but it also lets you know the kind of content that students are insecure on. So if you look at question 1, 2 and 3, you can see that those have been answered quite poorly, and that's something that I would need to go back and reteach in order for them to fully grasp it. But there's another feature of the Show My Homework multiple choice, which means actually I wouldn't have to go back and reteach. So here you can see that students have made a second attempt, and questions 1, 2 and 3 are answered slightly more securely. I didn't realise this facility existed at the time, but now I intend to give my students a pass mark, say 70%, which means that they have to keep going through the attempts until they get the pass mark that's required. So they would then teach themselves. It's kind of crazy in teaching that we assumed if the students haven't learned something, that that's somehow our fault and that we should reteach it, whereas actually the research says no, actually what we should do is retest the students and get them to relearn it because they're being retested. And then I had 5 students who had retaken it twice, I think, and 4 who had retaken it 3 times. And what was marvellous about this is I was able to show the names. Obviously I wouldn't do that in this video, but I showed the class the names of these students, only one of whom is a really hard-working student normally in class, and the other 3 are much more likely to get warnings for being off task and are well known around the school for causing problems, disrupting lessons with at least a low-level disruption and often quite worse. And what was fascinating was being able to show the class how their percentages had gone up. They all got over 85% in this test simply because of their determined effort. And that was a wonderful way to transform their opinions about where results come from. Not from innate intelligence, but actually from hard work. So having presented this, I then summarised for teachers the 10 ways that I tried to be really explicit in my modelling. And when I did this, I initially felt really satisfied with what I'd done. I asked teachers to rate my modelling, and they averaged an 8 out of 10, I think, in rating how effective my modelling was. Some people thought that I'd given too much information to the students and had therefore made it too easy for them, and other people weren't sure that I'd made some things explicit enough. But when I reviewed it, I realised that there was actually an elephant in the room. There was something really huge that I'd missed out. And I'd been thinking of the modelling, yes, from the student's point of view, but much more about what I would do as a teacher. And I think this is a fatal mistake we all make in teaching. We try to do a hell of a lot of work in order to improve our students. and actually I had missed something absolutely obvious. I wonder if you can spot what it is. Well, here's the start of my explanation. Absolutely everything I'd done was, I think, really good scaffolding. But this is a picture of really good scaffolding. It's fantastic. But we're not teaching students the scaffolding. We're trying to use the scaffolding to help them to see the big picture. And as you can see here, the Buddha is completely obscured. You can't really tell what this is. If I told you this was a hedgehog sitting upright waiting for its dinner, you couldn't prove that I was wrong, because the scaffolding has obscured what the students are trying to get to. And this is what my analogy is about. I've never actually given a whole essay to my students. How easy it would have been to have written an essay for them on 3 other poems. Well, I say easy, actually, for me as a teacher who could easily get an A star, it's not that easy to give them a B grade essay model, or even an A grade essay model. I could write one that would probably get an A grade, but it wouldn't look like an essay that an A grade student necessarily would produce themselves. And I didn't have a bank of previous essays. And this is something that you really need to think about in your departments. It's all very well relying on the excellent skills of your teachers and their excellent subject knowledge, but if you don't have the resources that they can use to model, then you're missing a trick. Now here, obviously, it would have helped if everyone in my department had been teaching the same essay, but in fact we weren't. We could have chosen any poet that we wanted from the list provided by the examiners. And this means that we didn't have precise models of what an essay should look like, although with a little bit of hunting we could as a department have a bank of essays at B grade, A grade and A star that would demonstrate exactly the skills that real students would use. And so partly I didn't think about this at all because it's not part of the culture of my department to do so. And one of the reasons for that is that the syllabus keeps changing every year, year by year, and often within the year, and we're always playing catch up. So I went back to the research and I went to Hattie's Visible Learning and also his second publication, Visible Learning for Teachers, and tried to find out what modelling would do. So this is the research on worked examples, and a worked example is an answer which is annotated explicitly for the skills that the students need and the subject knowledge that the students need. And that's its effect, D of 0.57, which is equivalent to over a grade improvement. So that's what the research tells us. If you model explicitly to your students, they will get a grade higher over the year than students who did not have that model. And that's why literacy and modelling, literacy through modelling, is so vital to your teaching. It leads to a grade improvement on average. So what was deeply puzzling to me was the fact that here's a year 11 essay. I wrote that in class while the students were writing some paragraphs of their own, because I had no problem in modelling the A star to them, and I could easily show that to a top set. When they sat a language exam, they all immediately groaned, and I thought, well, I really need to model what hard work looks like to top set students. And so I pointed out that I already had my O-level in English literature and my A-level and my degree, and in fact I'd also taken the GCSE when that first came out, so that I could find out what the demands of the new exam were. Prior to that it was 100% coursework. So anyway, I sat down for 50 minutes and simply wrote while they wrote, and I wrote 1,183 words in my 50 minutes. Not because I expected them to be able to do the same, but I wanted to be explicit about what hard work looked like. It meant me getting my head down and completely focusing on my task. It was a brilliant way to demonstrate to my students what to do, and they then mimicked my efforts. Not in terms of the content of what I'd written, but actually they just sat down and did their best without further protest or interruption. But it caused me to reflect on a problem that I think is common in schools, and that's that we tend to teach the students a need-to-know curriculum, and that's what scaffolding is. We're constantly working out what the students need to know and giving it to them in small chunks. Now the danger of that is we fail to give them the big picture. I've only taught them what I thought they needed to know. I haven't shown them more than I thought they needed to know. For example, if my students could learn these 12 things from simply us analysing 2 paragraphs, imagine what they could learn from a whole essay. I mean, I might at any time only be explicit about 1, 2 or 3 things, but depending on their different starting points, they could notice any of these things for themselves. Now, none of them are going to notice all of them, but I can't predict what they will learn from the model that I give them. But I can predict this: they won't learn anything that's wrong, because it's in my model and therefore it must be right. So anything that they learn is a bonus, and they can get ahead of my teaching. I'm no longer just relying on the chunks I give them. I'm focusing on the right chunks that I want them to move along at, in pace, in time, the whole class grasping the same things, but they're able to accelerate ahead of me or ahead of everybody else in their class by picking on the things that actually they notice. And that's the real value of giving them the big picture first. So what if I'd given my students a B grade essay, not after we'd studied the poems, but actually before we looked at the poems? That would have got them to think about the kind of vocabulary they needed to understand. They might not have known what assonance or enjambment was, but it would become apparent reading through the essay. They would start to decode things for themselves, or at the very least work out what it was they needed to learn when the lesson came about. A much more powerful way for them to operate as learners. And again, they could learn much more than I was explicitly teaching, because they would all come at the essay with a different starting point, whereas in my lesson I'm always teaching from the same starting point and building up in blocks. And hopefully there's at least one idea you can steal from this video in the modelling of writing in your subject. Good luck. If you found the video useful, please like it or recommend it to a friend.